12th June, 1942, the Mediterranean Sea, somewhere southeast of Malta. The sun has barely cleared the horizon, and already the heat is pressing down on the gray decks of a British battleship steaming at the head of a convoy. Sailors move along her flanks with the practiced calm of men who have done this 100 times before. Above them, 4 vast gun turrets loom against the sky, each one capable in theory of hurling a shell weighing as much as a small car over 20 miles of open water. Smoke rolls from her 4 funnels. To any observer watching through binoculars from an aircraft or a distant cruiser, this is unmistakably one of the most powerful warships afloat, a King George V class battleship, one of only 5 in existence, the pride of the Royal Navy's modern battle fleet. She is nothing of the sort. Beneath the gray paint and the looming silhouette, this is HMS Centurion, a ship laid down in 1911, a veteran of the Battle of Jutland, a vessel so old and so worn that the Admiralty had, years earlier, stripped her of her guns entirely and turned her into a floating target for gunnery practice. She carries no functioning main armament. Her towering turrets are wood and canvas stretched over scaffolding. Her extra funnel is sheet metal bolted to the deck. She is, in the most literal sense, a lie built from lumber, paint, and desperation, sailing directly towards a combined Italian and German force that could, if the deception failed, blow her out of the water in minutes. And yet the plan worked, or worked well enough. Reconnaissance aircraft spotted her. Reports went back to Rome and to German liaison officers monitoring the Mediterranean situation. Somewhere in the calculations of Axis commanders deciding whether to commit their battle fleet to intercept a British convoy, the presence of what appeared to be a fully armed modern battleship became a factor, a risk, a reason for hesitation. A collection of old timbers and clever carpentry had inserted itself into the strategic thinking of an entire enemy naval command. This is the story of how the Royal Navy, faced with a battleship shortage that threatened to strangle its ability to defend the most important convoy route in the Mediterranean, turned a retired, gunless relic into one of the most audacious deceptions of the naval war. It is a story about how, in the right circumstances, the appearance of power can matter almost as much as power itself, and about the strange, improvised genius of men who solved an impossible problem with plywood, rope, and nerve. Why does this matter? Because it reveals something the history books rarely emphasize about naval warfare in the Second World War, that intelligence, perception, and psychology could shift the balance of a battle before a single shell was fired, and that Britain, stretched thin across every ocean on Earth, learned to fight wars of appearance when it no longer had the material strength to fight wars of substance alone. By the summer of 1942, the island of Malta was starving. Sitting almost exactly halfway between Gibraltar and Alexandria, the tiny archipelago was the single most valuable piece of real estate in the Mediterranean theater, a base from which British submarines, aircraft, and surface ships could strike at the convoys supplying Axis forces in North Africa. Winston Churchill understood its value instinctively. So did the Italian and German high commands, which is precisely why they had subjected the island to one of the most sustained bombing campaigns of the entire war, dropping more tonnage of bombs on Malta in a matter of months than had fallen on London during the height of the Blitz. The problem was straightforward and brutal. Malta could not feed itself, could not fuel its aircraft, and could not resupply its ammunition without convoys arriving from the sea, and every convoy that attempted the run had to pass within striking distance of Axis airfields in Sicily and Sardinia, Axis submarines patrolling the approaches, and, most dangerously of all, the Italian battle fleet based at Taranto and Naples. That fleet, on paper, was formidable. It included modern, fast battleships of the Littorio class, vessels that could outrun and outgun almost anything the British could send to escort a convoy through those waters. Britain's difficulty was one of simple arithmetic. The Royal Navy's Mediterranean fleet had been ground down by 2 years of relentless combat, by losses at Crete, by the demands of the Atlantic and the Pacific pulling capital ships to other theaters, and by the sheer exhaustion of ships and crews who had been fighting almost continuously since 1940. When planners sat down in the spring of 1942 to organize what became known as Operation Vigorous, a convoy operation intended to run desperately needed supplies from Alexandria to Malta, they discovered they simply did not have a modern battleship to spare for escort duty. Every capable vessel was committed elsewhere, guarding against a Japanese incursion into the Indian Ocean, screening Arctic convoys to Russia, or under repair from previous engagements. This mattered enormously, because Italian naval doctrine, like most naval doctrines of the era, was built around the concept of the fleet in being. Commanders on both sides understood that a battleship's value lay not only in what it could do in combat, but in what its mere existence forced an enemy to consider. If British convoys sailed without heavy battleship cover, Italian commanders knew their own battleships, faster and more numerous, could intercept and annihilate the convoy escort, which typically consisted of cruisers and destroyers entirely outmatched by anything larger than themselves. Malta's supply line, in other words, was hostage to a piece of naval mathematics that Britain could not currently solve. There were not enough real battleships to go round, and without one the entire convoy risked being torn apart in open water by a superior force that could simply outshoot everything Britain had left to send. Existing solutions had already been tried and had already failed to fully answer the problem. Air cover from Malta itself could harass Italian ships, but rarely stopped them. Submarines could sink individual vessels but could not guarantee protection for a convoy in real time. Destroyer and cruiser escorts, brave as their crews were, stood little chance in a direct artillery duel with a Littorio-class battleship capable of firing shells at ranges beyond which most escort vessels could even reply effectively. The Admiralty needed something that did not yet exist in their order of battle, and building a new battleship was obviously out of the question. Warship construction on that scale took years, not weeks. The convoy was sailing in June. There was no time, no steel, and no dockyard capacity to produce a genuine solution. There was also a deeper structural problem underlying all of this, one that went beyond the simple absence of a spare battleship in June 1942. The Royal Navy of that period was fighting what amounted to 3 separate wars simultaneously, and the Mediterranean, however vital, was rarely first in line for reinforcement. In home waters, the threat of a German battleship or pocket battleship breaking out into the Atlantic to savage convoys, the fear that had already produced the Bismarck crisis a year earlier, meant that heavy units had to be held in reserve near Scapa Flow and Gibraltar. In the Far East, following the loss of Prince of Wales and repulse off Malaya in December 1941, a catastrophe that had shocked the Admiralty to its core, an entirely new fleet had to be assembled almost from nothing to face the Japanese advance across the Indian Ocean. Every capital ship the Royal Navy possessed was, in effect, being fought over by 3 theater commanders, each with a legitimate claim, and none of them able to spare a vessel for the Mediterranean without weakening a front that might collapse the moment attention shifted elsewhere. Malta's planners understood their predicament with unusual clarity. Admiral Sir Henry Harwood, commanding in the Mediterranean, and the wider naval staff in London, knew that Operation Vigorous could not simply be postponed until a real battleship became available, because Malta's stocks of fuel, food, and ammunition were falling towards a point of no return. Estimates circulating within the Admiralty at the time suggested the island had perhaps a matter of weeks, rather than months, of supplies remaining at current consumption rates, a timeline that made delay itself a form of surrender. If the convoy did not sail in June, there might be no functioning air base left at Malta by the time a proper escort could be assembled, which would in turn make every subsequent convoy attempt even more dangerous, since Malta's own aircraft and submarines played a crucial role in harassing Axis shipping and, indirectly, in protecting convoys elsewhere in the theater. The problem, in short, fed on itself. Weakness invited further weakness, and only a convoy running successfully could break the cycle. It was against this backdrop of genuine desperation, rather than idle cleverness, that naval planners began asking an unusual question. Not, how do we find a spare battleship? Because the honest answer was that none existed to be found, but rather, what would it take to make the enemy believe one was present? And would that belief alone be enough to buy the convoy the margin of safety it needed? This was not a question naval doctrine of the period had a ready answer for. It required someone to think less like a shipbuilder and more like a magician, understanding that the audience for this particular trick would never get close enough to inspect the mechanism, and that the illusion only had to survive the distance of an aerial photograph and the judgment of an intelligence officer reading a report thousands of kilometers from the ship itself. What Britain did have, sitting in reserve at Alexandria, largely forgotten by the wider war, was an old, disarmed hulk that nobody in Rome or Berlin had any particular reason to think about at all. The idea, when it surfaced within naval planning circles in the Mediterranean Command, was almost embarrassingly simple in concept and fiendishly demanding in execution. If Britain could not produce a real battleship in time, perhaps it could produce the appearance of one convincingly enough to affect enemy decision-making from a distance. Reconnaissance aircraft, after all, rarely flew close enough to a warship to inspect its rivets. They photographed silhouettes from altitude, sometimes through cloud, often under fire, and reported back shapes, proportions, and gun arrangements rather than forensic detail. If a ship's outline could be made to resemble a specific class of vessel closely enough to fool a reconnaissance pilot at several thousand feet, it might fool the intelligence officers who received his report, and it might, crucially, fool the admirals who used that report to decide whether engaging a convoy was worth the risk. The vessel selected for this transformation was HMS Centurion, and the choice made a strange kind of sense. Built at the Devonport dockyard and commissioned in 1913, Centurion had served at Jutland in 1916 as part of the Grand Fleet, survived the war, and then drifted through the interwar years in progressively less glamorous roles. By the 1920s, she had been converted into a radio-controlled target ship, her guns removed entirely, her hull reinforced to withstand being shelled repeatedly by other Royal Navy vessels during gunnery exercises. She was, in naval terms, expendable, obsolete, and entirely without offensive capability. She was also, by coincidence of hull proportions dating from an earlier design philosophy, roughly the right length and beam to be dressed up as something far more dangerous than she actually was. The work fell to naval dockyard engineers and shipwrights, almost certainly drawing on lessons the Royal Navy had already learned from its dazzle camouflage programs of the First World War, when ships were painted in disruptive geometric patterns not to hide them, but to confuse an observer's estimate of their heading, speed, and type. This was a more elaborate version of the same principle, extended from paint into full three-dimensional structure. Teams built false turrets from timber framing and canvas, shaped and braced to mimic, from a distance, the distinctive twin 16-inch gun turrets of the King George V class. A dummy funnel, fabricated from sheet metal, was erected to bring Centurion's silhouette from 3 funnels, or in some configurations far fewer, up to a profile matching her intended double. Superstructure was reshaped with additional plating and framework. The entire vessel was repainted in the appropriate camouflage scheme used by the genuine article. To put the scale of this work in perspective, imagine trying to disguise a family saloon car as a delivery lorry convincingly enough that a traffic camera photograph, viewed briefly by someone who has seen both vehicles many times before but only in passing, would record it as the wrong one. Now imagine doing that at sea, on a moving vessel over 200 meters long, using timber, canvas, and paint in wartime conditions, on a deadline measured in days rather than months, with the knowledge that if the disguise failed to hold up under a determined air attack, the ship carried none of the armament that would let her defend herself. The dummy turrets could not fire. The extra funnel produced no additional power. Every visual element added weight and complexity without adding a single ounce of genuine fighting capability. The engineering challenge went well beyond simply building something that looked roughly right when viewed head-on. A king, George V class battleship had a very particular profile from every angle, and reconnaissance aircraft rarely obliged by flying past on a single, convenient bearing. Designers had to consider how the false turrets would read from directly overhead, from the beam, and from low oblique angles typical of a reconnaissance pass under anti-aircraft fire, when a pilot might have only seconds to snap a photograph before banking away. This meant the timber and canvas structures had to have genuine three-dimensional depth rather than being flat, theatrical props, with framing that cast realistic shadows and produced a convincing silhouette regardless of the sun's position. Weight distribution mattered too. Piling several hundred tons of new timber, canvas, and metal plating onto a hull originally designed in the Edwardian era risked altering Centurion's trim and stability in ways that might themselves betray the deception. A battleship sitting unnaturally low or high in the water being exactly the kind of detail an experienced naval observer might notice even from a distance. There was also the question of color and weathering. A brand new coat of paint, applied uniformly and without the streaks, rust stains, and salt crusting that any working battleship accumulates after months at sea, could look suspiciously pristine to a trained eye. Convincing camouflage work of this kind, drawing on lessons the Admiralty's camouflage section had developed over several years of wartime experience, involved deliberately weathering the false structures, adding artificial staining and wear patterns so that Centurion's disguise looked lived-in rather than freshly built, as though she had genuinely spent months on active service rather than days in a dockyard basin. Riveted seams were painted onto smooth canvas panels. Ventilation grills and platform railings, the unglamorous clutter that covers every real warship's superstructure, were replicated in miniature to avoid the false turrets looking suspiciously clean and featureless against the genuine detail of the rest of the ship. Production numbers, in the conventional sense of a manufacturing program, do not really apply here, since this was a one-off conversion rather than a series build, carried out at a Mediterranean dockyard under wartime security. Exactly which yard performed the bulk of the disguise work, and precisely how long the transformation took, remains only partially documented in the surviving record, with some accounts suggesting the modification was refined and adjusted across more than one occasion between 1941 and 1942, as the Centurion was used repeatedly in this decoy role. What is clear is that this was not a single afternoon's work with a few pots of paint, but a sustained engineering effort treated with the same seriousness the Navy gave to any operational refit, precisely because the entire value of the deception depended on the details holding up to aerial photography and long-range visual observation. At dawn on the 12th of June 1942, HMS Centurion, disguised as the battleship HMS Anson, put to sea from Alexandria as part of the escort for Operation Vigorous, the Eastern convoy bound for Malta. She sailed alongside genuine cruisers and destroyers, taking her place in the formation exactly as a real capital ship would, her false turrets trained forward, her dummy funnel trailing smoke that dockyard engineers had ensured matched the output of her real boilers, since even the smoke had to look convincing from a distance. Axis reconnaissance aircraft found the convoy quickly, as they always did in a theater where Sicily and Sardinia sat within easy flying range of the shipping lanes. Photographs and visual reports went back through Italian and German channels, and the presence of what appeared to be a King George V class battleship among the escort became part of the operational picture being assembled by Axis Naval Command as they weighed whether to sortie the Italian battle fleet to intercept. What we can document with confidence is that Operation Vigorous itself was a brutal, costly affair regardless of the deception, one of the hardest-fought convoy battles of the Mediterranean War. The convoy came under sustained air attack for days. Losses were heavy on both the merchant and escort sides, and the convoy was ultimately forced to turn back towards Alexandria without reaching Malta. A reminder that no amount of clever disguise could substitute entirely for genuine firepower when the Luftwaffe and the Regia Aeronautica committed themselves fully to an attack. What remains genuinely contested, and where honesty about the limits of the historical record matters, is exactly how much weight Axis commanders placed on the reported presence of a modern battleship when they made their own decisions about whether to commit the Italian fleet to a surface engagement. Some accounts credit the Centurion deception with contributing meaningfully to Italian hesitancy about closing with the convoy in a full battleship action, given the risks a genuine King George V class vessel would have posed to their own ships. Other assessments are more skeptical, noting that fuel shortages, submarine threats, and overall Italian caution about risking capital ships were already sufficient reasons for restraint, with or without a disguised dreadnought in the mix. The psychological contribution of Centurion is real and documented as a deliberate British effort. Its precise causal weight in Axis decision-making is, and probably always will be, difficult to isolate with certainty. What is beyond dispute is the audacity of what British sailors were being asked to do. What is beyond dispute is the audacity of what British sailors were being asked to do. Men served aboard a vessel dressed as one of the most powerful warships in the world, while knowing, better than anyone, that she could not fire a shot in her own defense. If enemy aircraft, or worse, an actual Italian battleship had pressed a determined attack and called the bluff at close range, Centurion's crew would have discovered the truth about their own vulnerability in the worst possible way. Serving on her required a particular kind of nerve, standing exposed on a stage built specifically to attract enemy attention, while carrying almost none of the means to survive that attention if the audience stopped believing the performance. Accounts from men who served in the Mediterranean fleet during this period describe the strange psychological burden of manning a ship like Centurion, a burden quite different from serving on a genuine fighting vessel. On a real battleship, the crew's confidence rested on the tangible presence of armor plate and working guns, on the knowledge that if attacked they could shoot back and stood a fighting chance. Aboard Centurion, confidence had to rest entirely on the enemy's continued ignorance, on the hope that no reconnaissance pilot would fly quite low enough, that no photographic analyst in Rome would look quite closely enough, that no Italian commander would decide to test the bluff at close range simply to be certain. Every man aboard understood that the ship's greatest protection was not steel, but uncertainty itself, and that uncertainty, unlike armor, could evaporate in an instant if the wrong observer made the wrong call. This is not to say Centurion sailed defenseless in every sense. She retained genuine anti-aircraft weaponry throughout her decoy service, real guns capable of engaging low-flying aircraft, since a battleship with no visible means of self-defense at all would itself have been a curious and suspicious sight, and these weapons saw actual use during the air attacks that battered Operation Vigorous across multiple days in June 1942. What she lacked was the one thing her disguise most emphatically promised: the main battery capable of dueling another capital ship at long range, the 16-inch guns that gave the King George V class its reputation and its deterrent value in the first place. Should an Italian battleship have closed to engage her directly, expecting to face broadsides from turrets that in reality could not train, let alone fire, the encounter would have exposed Centurion in the most dangerous way imaginable, at exactly the range and moment when retreat was no longer an option. The wider convoy battle around her provides useful context for just how violent this stretch of the Mediterranean had become by 1942. Operation Vigorous saw waves of attacks from German and Italian aircraft based in Crete, Sicily, and the Dodecanese, alongside the ever-present threat of submarine attack and the shadow of the Italian surface fleet, weighing whether to commit to a full engagement. Merchant ships and escorts alike absorbed punishing losses over the several days the operation unfolded, and the eventual decision to turn the convoy back towards Alexandria without reaching Malta reflected the sheer weight of Axis air power in the theater rather than any single failure of British planning. Centurion's disguise was never intended to win this battle outright. It was one thread in a far larger tapestry of deception, escort, submarine screening, and sheer endurance that together defined how Britain tried, at enormous cost, to keep Malta supplied through the darkest months of the siege. It is worth remembering, too, that Centurion's decoy role did not begin and end with a single voyage in June 1942. Surviving accounts suggest she was employed in this disguised capacity on more than one occasion during the period when Malta's supply crisis was at its most acute, sailing repeatedly as a deterrent presence attached to convoy operations where a genuine capital ship could not be spared. Each voyage carried the same fundamental risk, the same reliance on distance and uncertainty rather than genuine firepower, and the same quiet trust her crew had to place in a piece of theater holding together under the worst possible scrutiny an enemy could bring to bear. If you are finding this story as extraordinary as I did when I first came across it, a quick subscribe genuinely helps this channel keep uncovering the stranger, lesser-known corners of naval history, the stories that never quite made it into the main textbooks. It costs nothing, and it helps more than you might expect. Now, back to the deception. Britain was not alone in exploring the idea of disguising ships to deceive an enemy, though the specific circumstances and stakes varied considerably between nations. Germany's most famous exercises in maritime deception during the war took a different form entirely, focused less on impersonating a specific class of warship and more on disguised commerce raiders, merchant vessels converted to conceal powerful naval guns behind false hull plating and dummy cargo structures. Ships like Atlantis and Cormoran, which sailed the world's oceans posing as innocent freighters before revealing themselves to attack unsuspecting merchant shipping. The German approach was offensive in intent, designed to lure and destroy, whereas the Centurion deception was fundamentally defensive and deterrent, designed to discourage an engagement rather than provoke one. The two approaches solved different problems, but both relied on the same underlying principle, that a ship's true nature could be hidden behind a convincing false exterior long enough to matter tactically. The American equivalent worth mentioning is less a single ship and more a doctrine, since the United States Navy, blessed with a shipbuilding capacity that dwarfed Britain's by 1943 and 1944, rarely needed to resort to disguising obsolete vessels as modern ones. When the Americans did use deception at sea, it tended to involve dummy landing craft, inflatable tanks, and fabricated radio traffic as part of the broader deception operation supporting invasions, most famously in the run-up to the Normandy landings, where entire phantom armies were constructed from canvas and wireless static rather than a single ship pretending to be another. The scale of American industrial power meant that where Britain in 1942 had to bluff because it lacked a spare battleship, by the middle of the war the Americans could often simply build the real thing and skip the theater entirely. What made the British approach distinctive, and arguably more elegant, was its economy. Centurion cost the Royal Navy almost nothing in new construction, drew on a hull that had no other operational value left, and achieved its effect purely through careful observation of how enemy intelligence actually worked, understanding that a reconnaissance photograph taken from altitude under combat conditions would never be scrutinized with forensic precision, and that a convincing silhouette was often good enough to do the job a genuine battleship would otherwise have had to do at enormous cost and risk. The concept was not entirely without precedent, since the Royal Navy had experimented with disguised or dummy warships in the First World War as well. But the Centurion operation refined the idea into something more deliberate and more directly tied to a specific, urgent strategic need, protecting the Malta convoys during the period when Britain's Mediterranean fleet was at its most stretched. It is also worth setting Centurion against the Italian Navy's own approach to the psychological dimension of the Mediterranean War, since the Regia Marina was not a passive audience simply waiting to be fooled. Italian commanders were themselves acutely conscious of the risk calculus involved in committing capital ships to battle, having already suffered a painful demonstration of British striking power at Taranto in November 1940, when carrier-launched aircraft crippled a significant portion of the Italian battle fleet at anchor in a single night. That memory alone made Italian admirals instinctively cautious about exposing their remaining battleships unnecessarily, a caution that Centurion's disguise could exploit far more easily than it could have done against a fleet with a history of aggressive risk-taking. In this sense, the deception did not need to be perfect. It only needed to be plausible enough to tip an already cautious command culture a little further towards restraint, which is a considerably lower bar than fooling an enemy inclined towards bold action, regardless of the odds. The scale difference with later Allied deception operations is worth dwelling on a little further, because it illustrates how quickly the balance of industrial power shifted over the course of the war. When the Allies mounted Operation Fortitude ahead of the Normandy landings in 1944, the deception involved an entire fictional army group, complete with dummy tanks and landing craft constructed from rubber and scaffolding, fabricated radio traffic simulating the routine chatter of divisions that did not exist, and even the deliberate movement of real, prominent commanders to locations designed to reinforce the fiction that the invasion would fall at Calais rather than Normandy. This was deception conducted from a position of relative strength, a supplement to overwhelming genuine force rather than a substitute for force that did not exist. Centurion's disguise in 1942, by contrast, was deception born of scarcity. A single ship standing in for a capability Britain simply could not otherwise provide at that moment. In a theater where the margin between survival and disaster for an entire island was measured in single convoys rather than entire military campaigns. Assessing the actual historical impact of the Centurion deception requires holding two things in mind at once, and resisting the temptation to resolve the tension between them for the sake of a tidier story. On one hand, the material effect of a gunless, disarmed old battleship on the outcome of any specific naval engagement was, by definition, zero. Centurion could not sink an enemy ship, could not shoot down an aircraft with real ammunition, and contributed nothing to the actual firepower available to defend the Malta convoys. On the other hand, the psychological and intelligence effect she was designed to produce was entirely real, deliberately engineered, and reflects a mature understanding within the Royal Navy that naval warfare in the 20th century was fought as much in the minds of enemy commanders interpreting incomplete information as it was fought with steel and explosive. The most honest assessment, and the one that most naval historians who have examined the episode tend to settle on, is that Centurion's disguise probably contributed at the margins to Axis caution, during a period when British forces in the Mediterranean desperately needed every margin they could get, without ever being the single decisive factor in any particular battle. Malta's survival, through 1942, depended on a combination of submarine operations, air defense, the bravery of convoy crews, and genuine improvements in British naval and air strength as the year progressed, and Centurion's contribution sits alongside these as one thread among many rather than a standalone masterstroke. Where the deception's legacy is clearer and less contestable is in what it reveals about British naval thinking under pressure, the willingness to solve a hardware shortage with an intelligence and perception-based solution rather than simply accepting defeat, and the institutional creativity that allowed dockyard engineers, camouflage specialists, and fleet commanders to collaborate on something this unconventional under genuine wartime urgency. The influence of this kind of thinking extended well beyond Centurion herself. The broader lesson that deception could substitute for material strength in specific, carefully chosen circumstances fed directly into the much larger deception operations Britain mounted later in the war, including the elaborate fictional army groups and dummy invasion fleets constructed ahead of D-Day. Centurion was, in a sense, a smaller and earlier proof of concept for an idea that would later be deployed on a continental scale. It is also worth considering the institutional confidence that the Centurion episode reflects, a confidence that is easy to overlook when the story is told simply as an amusing wartime anecdote. Approving a plan of this kind required senior naval officers to accept formally that a piece of theater belonged in a serious operational plan alongside genuine warships, real convoys, and real lives. That was not a trivial cultural step for an institution as steeped in tradition and hard-nosed realism as the Royal Navy. It suggests a command culture willing to experiment, to treat perception and deception as legitimate tools of naval warfare rather than distractions from the serious business of gunnery and maneuver, and it is this willingness, arguably, that represents Centurion's most lasting institutional legacy, more than any specific tactical outcome in June 1942. Historians examining the broader Malta convoy campaign have also noted how episodes like the Centurion deception complicate any attempt to write a clean, single-cause narrative of how the island survived the siege. It would be satisfying, from a storytelling perspective, to say that the disguised battleship saved Malta, or, conversely, to dismiss her role entirely as a curiosity with no real effect. Neither framing survives close examination of the record. Malta's survival was the product of overlapping factors: submarine crews operating from the island itself under extraordinary danger, Spitfire squadrons flown in at great risk to contest the skies, the resilience of a civilian population enduring bombardment on a scale rarely matched elsewhere in the war, and, yes, among these threads, the deliberate manipulation of enemy perception represented by ships like Centurion. Reducing the story to a single hero or a single object misses what actually made Malta's survival possible, which was the accumulation of many imperfect partial solutions applied simultaneously under conditions where no single solution alone would have sufficed. Centurion herself did not survive the war intact as a museum piece for future generations to visit, which is perhaps fitting for a ship whose entire wartime service was built around not quite being what she appeared. After her decoy duties in the Mediterranean, she was eventually expended in one of the most fitting final acts imaginable for a vessel built on deception and endurance in equal measure,